We are starting a new series today called You're Not the Boss of Me. And when I told my wife, Shonda, the title of the sermon series, she said, "Oh, you're going to be talking about me, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, I wasn't planning on it, but since you just gave me your permission, yes." Because my wife is the sweetest lady that I know. If you know her, she's sweet, she loves everybody, she tries to make you feel welcome. She's really awesome during the day. But at night, when it's bedtime, my wife changes into a little bit of a different person. She gets kind of mean when she's asleep, and so she'll fall asleep on the couch, and I'll go to try to get her to come upstairs, and I'll have to shake her. I'll be like, "Babe, come up," and she'll get kind of grumpy and she'll say things. But one of her favorite things to say to me is, she will look at me and go, "You're not the boss of me. I'm an adult. If I want to sleep on the couch, I'll sleep on the couch." And I'm like, "Honey, come on. No, you're not the boss of me." Well, what can you do? But here's the thing. We have all, either we've said that sometime in our life, or we've thought it, because we don't like people telling us what to do. Especially here in the mountains. I was having a conversation with Caleb, our connections pastor, the other day. He's from South Carolina. He moved up here and he said, "Man, one thing I had to learn real quickly living in the mountains is mountain people do not like to be told what to do." And I said, "You're right. We don't. We don't." And we're going to talk about that over the next couple of weeks. We're going to talk about the things that boss us around in our life. Now, before you get ahead of me, I know some of you are like, "Oh, you're going to talk about my mother-in-law. You're going to talk about my spouse. You're going to talk about my boss at work." No. We're going to talk about the things on the inside. Those things, those emotions that come out, and invariably, though we try to control them, like our temper, like our guilt, our shame, things like that, though we try to control them, when we get shook, when something happens, they come out. And we sit there and we go, I can't believe it came out that way. I can't believe I lost my cool that way. I can't believe I said that." We're going to talk about those things that try to boss us around, because oftentimes we think, "I don't want anybody telling me what to do." But many times, what's on the inside controls what we do. And it does tell us what to do. And so we're going to look at that, because here's the thing. If we can get a hold of this, can't we all agree we'd like to change some things about us that come out, that we don't want to come out on the inside? If we could see change in those areas, it would have ramifications on our marriages, on our parenting, and on our relationships, on our dating relationships, on our work relationships, just on life in general, as we become more of the people that we want to be, not the people that we sometimes are, that we regret. And to do that, we're going to see Jesus had a lot to say about this, about how your inside affects your outside. And we're going to look at a story in the Gospels in Matthew in chapter 15. We're going to go to verses 7 through 20. But let me set it up for you, because Jesus is here. He's teaching, and some Pharisees come to him. They're from Jerusalem. Pharisees, of course, were a religious sect of Jews that were super strict. They were defenders of the Old Testament law, they thought. And they were zealous about following the Old Testament commandments. But not only that, they had added to the Old Testament. They had this thing called the traditions of the elders. It was an oral tradition that was passed around. It would be codified into this thing we call the Mishnah 200 years after Jesus. But this time it was this oral tradition. It's things that they did. And they had rules for everything. Every little minute of your life they had a rule for. And they come to Jesus. They're always a thorn in Jesus' side. They come to Jesus and they ask him. They're like, "We've noticed that your disciples don't ceremonially wash their hands before they eat. And why is that?" And they're trying to get Jesus. They're like, "Your disciples aren't following the traditions of the elders, the rules that we've set up to keep us pure and undefiled before God." And Jesus flips the statement back on them, and he says, "Well, why do you nullify the commandments of God for your traditions?" Because these guys came up with this idea that one of the 10 Commandments was honor your father and mother, but they had figured a way around honoring their father and mother. They said that, when mom and dad got in old age, and if mom and dad were poor and destitute, you as a son, you should take care of them. But they'd figured out a way to keep their money and get around it. They said if we dedicate our money to God, then we don't have to take care of mom and dad. And Jesus is like, you nullify the commands of God for your traditions. And it's in that conversation that we come into what Jesus is going to say. But what Jesus is going to do, first Jesus is going, you can write this down, he's going to talk to them about their outward religion, but the fact that they have inward rebellion. He's going to show them that, hey, you got it all, you may have it all looking good on the outside, but what's going on in your heart, man, is just bad. And look at what he says, okay? Jesus, sometimes, man, he just gets straight to it. Look what he says. We'll start with verse 7. You hypocrites! Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. Let's stop there for a second. Look at what Jesus is saying. Now you got to imagine, for Jesus to look at these guys in this culture and to call them out like this would be shocking to the people around them, because everybody thought that the Pharisees, man, they've got it going on. In people's minds, if anybody was close to God, it was these guys. I mean, they did everything externally right. But Jesus calls them out. He calls them a hypocrite. A hypocrite, of course, we know is someone who says one thing and does a different thing. He says you're a hypocrite. Why? Not because they get it all right on the outside, but because he says you honor me with your lips, but your heart's not towards me. He's telling them you've got a great form of external religion going on. You live to the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, the heart of the law, the relationship with God, you don't have, is what he's saying to these guys. He's like, you're doing it all for the wrong reason. And that's what he said. You honor me with your lips, but your heart's far from me. And matter of fact, he goes on. Look what he says in verse 9. He says, you worship me in vain. That's really hard. He says, you worship me in vain. Your worship is meaningless. You're doing all these things, but it's in vain, because he slams them right here. He says, what you teach is just human rules. And so Jesus here is saying, hey, you guys got this outward religion thing going on. If we were to bring it into a modern context, he's like, that would be the good Baptist that goes to church every 3 weeks. I can rag on Baptists. I'm a Baptist. That goes to church every 3 days. Okay, not 3 weeks. But every 3 days, gets everything right, super upstanding, doesn't cuss, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. Just good person you think, but inwardly they are far from God. That's what he's talking about here. He's saying you got a form of religion, but you don't have a relationship. And the problem is, you see, these guys were constantly trying to trip Jesus up. Eventually, these would be men who would stand up and say, crucify him. They would charge him with blasphemy because he said he was God. And the thing is, these guys knew the Old Testament backwards and forwards, but they didn't understand the heart of the issue, that it was all pointing to the man that was in front of them. That it was God in the flesh, Jesus. They had a form of religion, but they missed the relationship with the one that all the stuff they thought they were doing would point to. And he goes on, look at this, man. He saves no words. He's talking to them, but then he brings the crowd in, and Jesus does a mic drop in the crowd. Look what he says here, verse 10. He called the crowd to him and he said, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them. What comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. Now the word defile means to be at odds with God. It means to be impure. And of course here, these guys had been taught all their life. They've been brought up on these dietary restrictions and rules. And at one point in history, they were right and they were true, but they were meant to set people apart. But Jesus came to fulfill all that old law and to fulfill it and to change it. And here he's saying, hey guys, what you eat doesn't defile you. But what comes out of your mouth does. And he's going to show us in a minute why that's true. And look at what he says here. He goes on in verse 12. The disciples came to him and they asked, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this? The disciples were like, dude, you called them out in front of people. They're upset. And then Jesus doubles down. Look at what he says here. Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Jesus is equating these religious leaders as not being part of God's garden. He's saying, hey, my Father didn't plant them. What they're about is not about what my Father in heaven is about, and they're going to get rooted up. And then he doubles down again and he says, leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. What Jesus is saying, he says, hey, these guys think they've got it all figured out. They think they're doing everything right, but they really are spiritually blind. And they were blind because they didn't get the fact that their Messiah was standing in front of them. Now, we will read a verse like that. We'll read it in our modern context. And we'll think it doesn't apply to us. Because we're really good at pointing out the hypocrisy of other people. We're really good at getting on social media and blasting people who we think don't do things right. And we're really good at seeing, the big stuff. The stuff you're like, wow, I can't believe we do that. We're really good at seeing, there's that show on HBO, The Righteous Gemstones. Viewer discretion advised. The pastor's not telling you to watch it, okay? But it is a good caricature of the prosperity gospel and televangelists. These guys, man, are over the top, just bad people. They do crazy stuff, man. I mean, they go and they try to beat up another pastor. The one dude's getting blackmailed for having strippers and cocaine. They are just bad people. And we look at that and we're like, oh, what hypocrites. It's easy to see that out there, and we should call it out. But what about the hypocrisy in our own life? What about the times that we don't do what we should do, or the things, the attitudes, the things in our heart, the things deep inside us that we know are at odds with God? And see, Jesus is about to make a powerful point to his disciples, and it's a powerful point for us. Because a lot of times we think that religion is all external behavior, but really, what happens on the inside is what God is most concerned with. Matter of fact, you can write this one down. God is most concerned about character over conduct. Yes, conduct's important, but it's the character behind the conduct that matters. It's the heart behind the actions that matters. It's what's going on in here that filters out there that matters the most. Remember the great commandment. God said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And when what's in here spills out there, a lot of times it's not loving our neighbor as ourselves. And Jesus is going to explain it to us. Peter says, explain the parable to us. And I love what Jesus says here. Verse 16, he says, are you still so dull? To translate it to our English, Peter, you stupid. Jesus asked them, don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes in the stomach and then out of the body? You eat it, then it's gone. But here it comes. But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. Now, the heart, just real quick, in Jewish thought and New Testament thought, is the center and substance of who you are as a person. We hear heart in our modern tense, and a lot of times we think, well, that's just the organ that pumps blood through my body, but it was thought of the center of who you are. It's where your character and the depth of who you are, where it resides. And Jesus is saying that what comes out of your mouth and the actions that you take towards others is a matter of the heart. That's why God's more concerned about your character than your conduct, because deep down it's your character that will drive your conduct. It's your heart that will drive the attitudes that you have towards people and the things of God. It's your heart that will drive the words that you say. And sometimes we'll say this. Andy Stanley has a great statement. He says He says, we will say, well, I didn't mean to say that. How many times have we said that? I've said that. I have looked at my wife before and been like, honey, I didn't mean to say that. But Jesus would push back and say, you didn't mean to say that out loud. Think about it. It's true. It's so true. And he says, what comes from our heart? And what comes out of our heart? Look, he gives a list here. He goes on. He says in verse 19, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. Mark would add in his list of this, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. And of course you can look at those and say, well, I never do that. But Jesus, of course, would go deeper in the Sermon on the Mount and say, you may say, well, I'm not a murderer. But Jesus said, well, if you hate somebody, you've murdered them in your heart. Someone would say, well, I'm not an adulterer. Jesus would say, well, if you lust after someone, you've committed it in your heart. On and on and on. It's out of the depth of our heart that who we are sometimes comes out. When we're shaken, what's inside will come out. I've got something here. I brought a jar of M&M, peanut M&Ms. And I want you to think about this. This is not original in me. This is an Andy Stanley illustration, but it was so good I had to use it. When I shake this, what comes out is determined by what's in the jar, right? When you get shaken, what comes out is determined by what's in your jar. So think about it. You get angry at your spouse. You get really upset about something. They did that thing again that grates on your nerves. You get mad, you get shook, and what comes out? What comes out? You're at work. You're at work. And that coworker does something that you don't like. You get shaken. And it comes out. You're driving down the road. Someone makes you mad. It really comes out. But I want you to look at something. I made a mess. And when the things that are in here spew out on everybody around us, we make a mess. Because our heart's coming out. I had a bad day this week, okay? I had one of those days where it was just a bad day. I was in a foul mood. And Walker, my son-in-law, I met him at the coffee shop. He got in the car. We had to go do some stuff. And we were driving around the back side of the mill. I was in such a foul mood. I cut in front of a lady at a red light. That started it. If you're that lady, I apologize. I love you. Seriously. Then I'm coming around the back side of the mill. It's where all the trucks come through. It's hard for those big trucks to make the curve. I was in a foul mood. It's all my fault. I'm staying in the right lane, but I forget they got to make the curve, so they're going to cut me off. I perceive that this big truck about killed me. No, it's my fault. So I see red. I get upset. I lay down on the horn, dude. Walker is sitting next to me just going, what are you doing, dude? But then he looks at me. He knows. He says this sentence, don't do it. Don't do it. Well, I did it. I rolled the window down, and before I knew it, I'm doing hand gestures. Yeah. While it's funny on one level, it's horrible. It hurt me, and I in that moment, Walker's just like, he goes, "You have a church sticker." I'm like, I know. I got up to the car, man, and I felt so guilty. I should have. I was guilty. I had to ask God to forgive me. If that truck driver's here as well, I apologize. I was wrong. Nothing funny about that. I was an idiot. But that was my heart coming out. And I sit there and I thought, Lord, I thought it's been a long time since I've had like anger get me that much. And I realized there's still stuff in my heart that I got to deal with, man. You guys relate to that? There's still stuff in there I don't like. You see, I got shook. And I got shook enough that what was deep down in there spewed out. Spewed out. We all deal with that. And that's what Jesus will say, you know. These are what defile a person. Because what's on the inside affects what's on the outside. And what affects the outside affects the people around you, and it can make a big mess in your life. But here's the encouraging thing. And next week we're going to talk about guilt, by the way. We have a boss greater than the emotions and our heart that tries to boss us around. His name's Jesus. We are works in progress. You come to faith in Jesus and He begins the process of changing you from the inside out, changing those deep-seated hurts and emotions and changing your heart. And He is greater than those things. And that's the encouragement, that even when you fall flat on your face like I did, He's there in His grace to still move you on down the road and continue to change you. Matter of fact, listen to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 29. He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Now just stop there and think about that. Jesus says, if you're weary and you're burdened, you're carrying some junk in here. You said that thing out loud that you didn't want to say again. You hurt that person close to you one more time. He says, come to me, and I can give you rest. You're weary. You're burdened. Let me take that off of you. He goes on in the text, and listen to what he says here. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. A yoke, of course, when you think about an animal, is something you put on it to pull a cart. It's a burden, but he says, take my yoke. Learn from me. He says, I'm gentle and I'm humble in heart. Here's the good part. You will find rest for your souls. We're going to look over the next couple of weeks at all kinds of things. All kinds of things that try to boss us around. Or shame, or guilt, or anger. The list goes on. But before we can get into any of that, we've got to nail down this. We've got to have the boss of our souls, the boss of our life, the leader of our life, leading our life. And so what's the remedy for everything I've talked about today? Before you get into any of the life change, you have to nail down and have the life changer in your life. Jesus said, come unto me in that text. That means enter into relationship with me. It's not about the religious rules you follow. It's the relationship you have with me, Jesus says. Some of you are here today. You're pretty heavy burdened. You've been trying to do life on your own. You've been trying to change yourself from the inside out, and it's not working. I will tell you that you need to give your life to Jesus. He's the one that can change you. Now, I know a lot of you in here, you're believers. You say, I've done that, Heath. You're like, you've done that, Heath, and you still lose your cookies sometimes. What hope is there? Here's the thing. We're all a work in progress.
Amen.
But we've got to open up and give those areas of our heart that we've closed off to the Lord. Because see, a lot of times I get in a mess and I get whittled out and I get hollowed out and I get shooken and I spill out because I'm trying to carry the load on my own. And I'm not bringing the problem to the one who can solve the problem. I'm not being led by my leader, my Lord. And so for some of us in here, maybe a lot of us in here, what we've got to do is, if we're honest with ourselves, there's areas of our hearts that we need to open up, we need to expose, to the power of the gospel, to the power of the Lord. David, the psalmist, would write back in the Old Testament, he would say, "Search me, O Lord. Search my heart, Lord." Now we know that in Jesus, when you come into a relationship with Christ, you are justified, you are made right in the eyes of God, you are in a right standing with Him, but you're still in a lifetime of being changed and molded and grown to be more like Him. You will still sin, you will still fall, and there are seasons when our prayer needs to be, "Search my heart, Lord." Reveal those things, God, that I don't even realize are issues deep down inside. Before we get into all the other stuff we're going to talk about, that needs to be our prayer. Search me. Search my heart. Show me those areas that are contributing to when I get shaken, I just spill out around everybody. If you will do that, if you will sincerely do that and be honest about that, you will be amazed at the change that God can change in your life, because I believe the first step to any real change, even heart change, is awareness of what's going on in here. It'll make the difference. Imagine the change in your marriage if you got this. Imagine the change in your parenting if you got this. Imagine the change in your relationships with others if you got this. If you begin to allow God to mold and shape you from the inside out. Because at the end of the day, guys, He's far more interested in your character than your conduct, because ultimately it is your character that will drive your conduct. And that comes from your heart. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Let's pray, guys. Father, we are grateful, Lord, for the words of Jesus here, challenging us, showing us, God, that often the external things that we do, that we think, just make us right, often, God, are lacking because we don't have the heart behind them. Lord, I'm going to pray for all of us this prayer. Search our hearts. Show each of us in this room where we're lacking, where we're guarded, and where we need change. We need it, Lord. We need you. And God, there's this huge amount of hope, God, because we know, Lord, that we may be burdened with some difficult things right now, things we don't like about ourselves, things we hate about ourselves. We know we can find our rest in you, and you, Lord, are greater than anything that might hold us back in our relationship with you. We look forward to the change you're going to do in our lives, God, as we surrender to you. We pray this in your name, Jesus.